Today's book is The Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince by Robin Hobb. Now, I think this is a kind of book I probably never would have picked up otherwise. So I'll give some brief background as to why I picked this up. Basically, I was in an airport. I was in an airport in Chiang Mai in Thailand. So the English selection was limited and a lot of the books were really overpriced. When I'm flying, I tend to get a headache on the planes, motion sickness and stuff like that. So I'm looking for kind of lighter stuff anyways. I don't want anything that's going to be a heavy read. There were a couple history books that caught my interest. I'm a history buff, so I don't consider those heavy reads if they're kind of well written. But they were way overpriced. So I was looking more at the fantasy books then. I've always had a soft spot for fantasy, even though I'm getting old now. It's a little bit of a childish indulgent, but it's been one of my soft spots. One of the difficult things about fantasy, though, is it's so hard to find a self-contained story, right? You go to the fantasy shelf on the bookstore, you pick up a book, and it's always like part 3 of a series, and you're like, well, I don't want to start at part 3, I want to start at part 1. And more so than that, is it just me, or is it getting harder and harder to tell which part of a series these books are? Like, I think it used to be you picked up a book and it would be like part 3 of 5 of the something series. I think they must have stopped doing that because they know people won't buy it if it says part 3. So it just says this story, and then it says by the author of this series. And you're like, okay, is this part of a series? I think they've been trying to hide kind of that some books are like mid-part of a series so they can sell them to new readers. I don't know, maybe that's just me being paranoid. Anyways, I'm going through the books. It's a bit hard to tell, but it looks like most of them are kind of midway through a series. It's very hard to kind of jump on at the beginning with a fantasy book. This book, Robin Hobb, who I've never read anything by her, although I recognize the name. I think I've seen her books around in bookshops. Was looking through this, and it looks like this was a self-contained story. Now, she does have this kind of whole series she writes. And it does say at the very back, what does it say? Long before the time of chivalry farcier. So there's like a character she's written about before called Chivalry Farcier, and this is kind of like in that same world, but a prequel to it, but it was kind of looked like it was self-contained. And to kind of jump ahead of myself, now that I've read the whole thing, yes, it is self-contained. It was very short. It was 159 pages, not particularly small print, so very easy to read through. In fact, I bought this in the airport, and I had finished it by the time I got off the plane. Now, that's not purely on the plane flight. That's counting like changing flights and kind of waiting for the plane and stuff like that. But, basically finished it in an afternoon. So if you're looking for a book you can easily finish in an afternoon, this is one of them. After I got home, I did go on the internet and kind of look this book up on Goodreads and stuff like that. And trying to see if this was part of a series or how it connects to something. I think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I don't really know this author well. I think all of her books take place within a fantasy world. There's a Farseer trilogy, which is kind of what's referenced here with Chivalry Farseer. But according to the internet, the Piebald Prince was first mentioned in the Tawny Man trilogy. Now, they mention him as like an old legend. And it's, I don't know, a throwaway line or a plot point, or I don't know, I've not read it. It's some sort of old legend that's referred to in her other fantasy books. And so this is kind of that legend fleshed out. Right, so to talk about this book itself, it's a fantasy book Of course, just that on its own doesn't really tell you much, right? Because fantasy can kind of, you've got, it can go anywhere from The Wizard of Oz to The Lord of the Rings to Conan the Barbarian. Like, there are lots of types of fantasy books. So how to describe this one? I would describe this as fairy tale-esque for a few different reasons. It kind of starts off in the story in a castle of a royal family and a princess. Actually, the point of view character is the daughter of the wet nurse to the princess. But yeah, kind of that fairy tale setting. Now the plot, if you were to strip this down to its bare bones and kind of boil it down to just a synopsis, I think would sound very similar to something you'd find in the Grimm brothers. I've actually been kind of working my way through this recently, so I can say this with some authority, as somebody who's been kind of working my way through these Grimm brothers fairy tales. The plot of this book is not so dissimilar from one of their stories. Now the Grimm brothers, when you read them, they're not 20th century novelists, 21st century novelists. They write kind of very bare bones kind of outlines. This is a modern book, so it reads a lot more like a modern book than the Grimm brothers fairy tales, and yet there's an element of minimalism in the narrative that is somewhat fairy tale-esque, not quite as much as the Brothers Grimm. But the narrator of the story is telling this story that kind of has happened a long time ago at this point. So she's kind of, it's not like a lot of these novels where the author is omniscient and has kind of the thoughts and minds of every character, and it's like you're in the room with them and they're describing every detail of the scene as it happened. This is more kind of a character kind of recounting this thing that had happened within her lifetime, but it's somewhat far in the past for her now. And she doesn't even know all the details of the story, so she kind of will kind of allude to things that she wasn't present for. And all of that narration is kind of very bare bones, not quite as bare bones as the Brothers Grimm, but somewhere on that spectrum. So that also kind of gives it a fairy tale type feeling. And then I guess along with the Brothers Grimm, there's magic in here, but it's not so in your face. The magic is a little bit in the background, at least certainly at the beginning of the book. It becomes more prominent at the end of the book. I'm going to spoil some things, and before I do that, let me just kind of give a summary of the opinion here. I largely enjoyed this book. I wouldn't recommend anyone go out of their way for it. So like you don't have to track it down on Amazon and order it. But if this would happen to fall into your lap, if you see it at the local library, or if you're in the airport and you see this at the bookshop, yeah, it's worth a read. It's nothing that's going to blow your mind, but it's a short, pleasant, sweet little read, well written. You finish it easily in an afternoon. Quite a pleasant little book. Okay, that being said, get into the plot here, talk about what I like and didn't like about the plot. So it starts off, the point of view characters is the princess's wet nurse, but there's this princess who's very willful and kind of headstrong, who falls in love with the stable boy. And the stable boy is very quiet and shy, but he's got beautiful hair and kind of milky white skin, and there's kind of something about him. Now, I'm not big on romance novels. It's just a personal thing, especially kind of sappy type of romance novels. So I was reading this and I thought, shoot, I bought the wrong book. I should have bought something else. But no help for it now. I'm on the plane. I got to stick through this. I thought, I don't want to read about the headstrong princess and the shy stable boy and their romance. It just seems sappy. It also seemed a bit cliche. I mean, like, wasn't that the plot of The Princess's Bride? The Princess Bride, the movie, right? She was in love with the stable boy who, as well. It just seemed like a princess romance cliche. So that part got a little bit boring. But again, it's a short book. So about halfway through the book, and again, it's short, so halfway through is only like about 60 pages in, the focus of the book shifts. And then we're not talking about the princess and the stable boy's romance then. We're talking about the child that's born of that romance. Actually, there ends up being two children who are born around the same time and are kind of growing up in the aftermath of that with the stigma of being kind of half royal and half stable boy. And then you get into the politics of the kingdom, like is the king going to kind of make the bastard son his heir, or there's also like the king's brother's son is kind of going to take over the kingdom. So that's interesting. And then it gets quite political. It still has kind of that fairy tale story-esque quality to the narration, but there are now two factions that are vying with each other, and that all gets quite interesting. And then it's over before you know it, and you're like, oh right, it's over already. I feel like I barely got to know those characters, which is, the disadvantage of a short book, is you barely get to know these characters. But then the advantage of a short book like this is then all of a sudden you're done with it, and you can walk off the plane, and you're like, all right, I don't have, I mean, it's nice to get stuck in a long book every now and again, but it's nice to just kind of knock off a short one every now and again as well. So this one definitely ticked that box. Other things I liked, the willful princess at the beginning was causing kind of a crisis by refusing to marry anyone in the kingdom. Said, no, I'm going to be the queen. I'm going to do it all by myself. I don't want to share power with anyone, even though people kept trying to put matches on her. That reminded me, of course, of Elizabeth I. Again, as someone who's a history geek, that was kind of very much the political issue of her reign. I suspect that was intentional, like Robin Hobb was deliberately using that as a model, because kind of some of the situations and some of the lines seem like it was kind of ripped from those Elizabethan histories. When later in the book, when you get to these kind of two factions that are at court, I thought it was kind of interesting how, like, so there's the Duke Canning, Buck Canning, there's a Canning guy, and then there's the Piebald prince. And the Canning guy is not the good guy, like he's not terribly sympathetic, but you do get the sense that he doesn't want a fight just yet, and that events kind of spiral out of his control because he can't really control the people under him. And the same is happening with the Piebald prince. He's not entirely in control of his faction either, and so like these little fights break into bigger fights. I don't know, it's a small thing, but I thought that was well done. And I thought that's also kind of, yeah, I mean, that's how it happens in real history a lot of times, right? People don't, these little events kind of snowball out of control, so even people who are nominally leaders of different factions kind of lose control of the momentum of what's happening. Anything else I liked? Want to comment on? I don't know. I think I'll call that good. It's a short little book here, so there's no sense in making too much of it. I'd recommend it if you come across it.